Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is your weekly Washington Policy Pulse on the Balance of Power podcast. I'm Joe Mathieu. Every Monday, Bloomberg Intelligence senior policy analyst and friend of the show, Nathan Dean, shares his weekly call on upcoming catalysts in the nation's capital. Listen for the most recent and relevant policy research from our team at Bloomberg Intelligence. Now with today's installment, here's Nathan Dean.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nathan Dean. I am a senior policy analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence here in the Washington, D.C. Bureau. We want to say welcome for joining us on the Washington Policy Pulse. And specifically for those of you on the East Coast of the United States, we hope that you are safe and sound, especially for those of you up in New York and Boston. We hear the snow is quite bad at the moment. But again, I'm hoping this is one of those situations where the children are more not bothering you as you try to work type of situations. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about President Trump and obviously the Supreme Court ruling from last week on IEEPA. We also want to talk about the State of the Union address. But before we do that, let me bring in Holly From, our senior litigation analyst. Holly is the one who's been leading Bloomberg Intelligence's research on the tariffs and specifically the tariffs ruling. And so, Holly, as the tariff ruling came out last week, what were your initial reactions? What was your thoughts? And as President Trump subsequently announced that he was going to increase or at least levy a 10% tariff via Section 122 and then increase that to 15% via executive order, what are your thoughts that have come out from over the weekend in terms of President Trump's next steps?
So I think the important thing to note from the Supreme Court's ruling is that he is not allowed to impose any tariffs using IEEPA. So the Supreme Court found that the tariffs were a tax and that taxing power is firmly vested in Congress. And the statute didn't clearly authorize him to impose tariffs. The regulate import language, that language regulate has never been used to confer a power to tax. So they said Congress didn't do that here. So what that means is that any tariffs he's imposed using IEEPA are probably going to be struck. So the tariffs on India and Brazil are probably going to be struck as well. I think with respect to Section 1, the 122 tariffs, I think he's probably on good legal footing there because that's the statute that the lower court said he should have used to address trade imbalances. And what that statute allows him to do is to impose a 15% tariff for 150 days if there's a serious balance of payments deficit. And the court went into length, the lower court went into great length to explain why they think a trade imbalance falls under that definition, a serious imbalance of payments issue. So I think he's on good legal footing there. It can be challenged if, for example, people are saying what's happening, what exists in the world now is not a serious balance of payments issue. But the statute doesn't say who has discretion to determine that. And I don't think courts are going to be too inclined to second guess the president's determination. So that's what I think about Section 122. I think the waffling, though, where, he imposed it via executive order and said his advisors say a 10% tariff is necessary. And then he comes out the next day and says, actually, no, 15%. I think that makes it a little bit shakier because it doesn't seem justified. But I think, he probably will put out another executive order probably on February 24th, I'm expecting. And if he further clarifies why the 15% tariff is necessary, I think that will ultimately be upheld.
So, we had a question in here, you expect the legality of the 122 tariffs to be challenged. And I think from your answer, it's no.
Well, it could be challenged. It could be challenged, but I don't think a challenge would succeed.
Okay. Yeah. And I would also just say, because I've gotten a similar question on the congressional side, will you see Congress, because the 122 only goes for 150 days till you need congressional authorization. I don't anticipate we'll ever see Congress have to opine on this. For two reasons. One is, and this is where I'm going with my next question, is to explain what 232 and 301 is and whether or not President Trump will then transfer these tariffs from 122 to those other statutes. And secondly, I think Republicans will just say, look, they're going to look at the political reality of President Trump's actions, and they'll say, look, we don't need to have authorization on this. So, that being said, if my theory is correct, the one that we've been floating around is that, President Trump will then go from 122 to 301. Can you explain the difference between 232 and 301? And when President Trump just said just minutes ago that nations that, quote, play games with the United States, and I think he's referring to the European Union here, because we saw reporting from just this morning that the European Union has paused negotiations or paused its ratification of the trade deal. What does he mean by playing games here?
Okay, well, with respect to 301, he's allowed to impose tariffs if he finds a country isn't honoring trade agreements or is treating America or is discriminating against U.S. commerce. He's used this before in 2018 against China on over $300 billion worth of goods from China, when he said that they were violating trade agreements with respect to intellectual property. Now, with regard to 232, that is a tariff that's a statute that allows the president to impose tariffs if imports threaten to impair national security. So he can use this statute, but he probably can't use it on a countrywide basis. It probably has to be sector specific. So you've seen him use it on autos, for example, steel and aluminum. Both of these require investigations. 301 requires an investigation by the U.S. Trade Rep, and 232 requires an investigation by the Department of Commerce. But he's already begun some of those investigations. So it's not like a clean slate with respect to all tariffs that he could impose via 301 and 232. He started some investigations already, so that those could be, on the horizon. But with regard to, playing games in the EU trade deal, the EU trade deal, I believe it was at 10%. And so the increase to 15% is something that they won't accept. The question is whether, if they say that they won't accept anything now, like a 10% or 15%, if they won't accept the 10% that they previously agreed to, the question is, does the president have legal authority under Section 301 to say they're not honoring trade agreements? And it's not clear, because the trade agreement was entered into under the IEEPA statute, which the Supreme Court says is unlawful. So arguably, there's no legal basis for that trade agreement. Congress hasn't approved it. That's another reason why it could be suspect and may not be subject to 301 tariffs. But with regard to Section 122, he could still impose the 15% tariff.
Gotcha. Okay. We had a couple of questions come in, and I actually think the easiest way for me to answer some of these questions is to share my screen and show you an analysis that Bloomberg Economics put out. So if you just bear with me for 1 second. These are from our friends over at Bloomberg Economics. Let me go ahead and hide that. Sorry. Let me get that. Okay. Everybody can see my screen. Thank you very much. So, Section 122 plan falls short of replacing IEEPA. We see here 2024, we see the pre-ruling, Section 122 IEEPA tariffs. And then if you go to the Section 122 IEEPA replacement plan, you can see that the effective U.S. tariff rate has decreased slightly because of the pre-ruling versus the 10% or just the 15% ruling. And for those of you who are on the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast, I just realized you can't see this screen. So that if you do feel that you need to see this charts, please feel free to come back. We will actually be happy to show this to you. I apologize that we're doing this spur of the moment. And then if you come down just a little bit, and for those of you on the terminal, just ping me. The analyst who's leading this is Nicole Gorton-Caratelli over at Bloomberg Economics. Feel free to reach out to her. Feel free to reach out to me. I will make sure that you get this insight into your inbox. But you can see here on a country by country basis, we have the pre-ruling, which is the white dot, the Section 122 IEEPA replacement plan, which is the yellow dot, and then the Bloomberg orange dot, and then we have the 15%. So you can see in some cases, obviously, there was some increases. In some cases in China, there's a significant decrease here. And so I think this is a lot of the information that's going to be played out over the next couple of weeks, because there are winners and losers to President Trump's plan here. So I'm going to head stop my sharing, come back. And just check the questions real quick. Holly, there was a question about legal challenges to the new tariffs. Could courts pause their implementation, unlike what we saw through IEEPA?
With regard to the 122 tariffs, well,
Yeah, if there was one.
I don't think they do that because they didn't do that with the IEEPA tariffs, even when they ruled that they were unlawful. So the lower court said they're unlawful, but we're going to stay our ruling until this goes all the way up. And the Federal Circuit did the same thing. We find this unlawful, but the ruling was stayed. The Supreme Court stayed application of the Federal Circuit's ruling until they ruled. So even when you have a challenge that's successful, they stayed it until the Supreme Court could rule. So I don't foresee that happening.
Okay. No, it sounds good. Let me just make sure. And what would you think, another question came in is like, would he be able to keep the average tariff rate around that 15% level once the 122 tariffs expire? What's the limit on 301?
There is no limit on 301,
Okay.
but he'd have to find every country that he imposed this 15% tariff on, or his U.S. trade rep would have to find every country that he's used 15% against has discriminated against U.S. commerce or violated a trade agreement.
Okay. So, and that would come through a notice and comment period, or at least the investigations go via a notice and comment period, correct? But investigations have already started. I just want to clarify, so for the folks listening, investigations. So 122 only goes for 150 days. We don't anticipate congressional authorization. They have already started investigations via 301, correct? Okay.
Right, on China.
On China. But what about, like, let's just say I'm going to just pluck out Argentina because I had chimichurri this past weekend. If there was an investigation on Argentina, would they have to do a separate notice and comment period for that? Or could they lump that in with something else?
I don't know that there's any existing investigation that they could lump that in with. But you could see all the investigations that they've done, that they've opened, and that's on the, I think it's a Business Industries webpage. It's a division of the Department of Commerce. So you could see all the ones that have been open. I don't think there's one that they could lump Argentina into. So if it was an investigation that, it's a new issue, they'd probably have to open a new investigation for that.
Okay. So it's not one of those situations where they can just blanket, there's got to be an investigation. And I guess that brings some clarity to the markets because, yes, I'm not going to say that there's clarity post this ruling, but if we at least know that there has to be a notification period for an investigation, we can at least go back and say, here are the investigations that are taking place, here are the ones that aren't taking place, and we can at least try and get some ideas there. So, okay, Holly, last question I have for you is, let's talk about refunds. The court didn't address refunds. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, look, and I'm paraphrasing here, refunds aren't really in the cards right now. How is this refund chaos going to play it out? I presume it would have to go back down to a lower court and somebody would have to sue to get that refund. Am I right? So
that's probably what's going to happen. They can try to apply to the customs agency, but if the customs agency doesn't refund their money, then they would have to go to the court. And so typically, so they think there's this existing case that's been filed by a bunch of companies. They were consolidated into one lawsuit before the International Trade Court. And that may be the vehicle that the court uses to explain how these refunds should be sought and what procedures are necessary. But there was this thinking that they may just use the old procedure, which is the procedure used for challenging any a duty that they think that you think was wrongfully paid. So there's a procedure whereby the importer, when the importer enters goods or imports goods, on the date of entry, they have to say to the customs agency what they think these goods, what they think the right amount to pay is. And so that's based on what the classification of the goods are, what the duty rate is. And within 314 days of entry, the customs agency decides whether that was the right amount or not, whether they owe more. And that's called liquidation. And when that's finalized, when the duties liquidate, it's called the amount is finalized by the customs agency, the amount they owe. The importer then has 180 days to challenge that. It's called by via a protest. And so they're thinking that they're going to have to do something like that. So they're going to have to file some kind of, application procedure and say, we paid this, we shouldn't have paid it, and see if customs remits. And if they don't, then they would probably have to file a lawsuit.
So just to summarize.
Some lawyers are recommending to their clients, do both. Because there are these deadlines and they don't want the deadlines to expire. So do both. Apply to a customs agency and file a lawsuit. And some of them recommended they do that before the Supreme Court even rules because some of the deadlines are passing.
So what I'm hearing for you is that if you're a trade lawyer who's about refund litigation or Section 301, you're probably going to have really good job security for the next 3 years, I'm guessing. Because it sounds like all of this is just headed to the courts.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be like litigation not definitely, but I think there's going to be litigation that arises out of this.
So, okay. Sounds good. Thank you, Holly. I don't see any more questions about tariffs. We do have a webinar tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern that is going to have Holly, our friends from Bloomberg Economics, Nicole who wrote that piece on the countries. We're also going to have other analysts talking about the sectors like retail and technology. So if you do want to attend that webinar, just feel free to reach out to me. I'll make sure that you get that link. That's at 10 a.m. Eastern. And if you missed that, there is going to be a replay. But Holly, thank you very much for joining. I know you got a busy day, so I'll let you go. And then I'll just talk about State of the Union, and then we will let everybody get back to their day jobs. So State of the Union, there are really, I think, three themes that we're going to see tomorrow. This is tomorrow night around 8 p.m. Eastern. Obviously, President Trump's going to come in. He's going to address the Congress. The Supreme Court's going to be there. Kalshi already has on the betting markets. Is he going to shake John Roberts' hand or not? Right now, the no's have it. I didn't look at the number, but the no's are saying that they think President Trump's not going to shake his hand. But anyway, there's three themes that I think you should keep in mind. One is geopolitical. Let me get this right. There we go. One is geopolitical. Obviously, the question about Iran. Now, I'm not going to talk about this because obviously I focus on U.S. domestic policy. But again, my friends over at Bloomberg Economics have a great piece of scenario analysis of what could come out. Now, President Trump has been, at least according to Bloomberg News, the latest from Bloomberg News is that President Trump was thinking about a limited strike on Iran. The negotiations are scheduled for Thursday, and then you would have a much more intense strike sometimes later if negotiations falter and so forth. But again, that's the Bloomberg News. But if you do need a geopolitical analyst to discuss this in greater detail, please let me know, and we'll get you in touch with Jenny and her team. Now, the two domestic themes that you're going to hear is one is my colleague Dwayne Wright put on a great note on healthcare, talking about changes to the Affordable Care Act. Now, the reason why there's going to be talks about the Affordable Care Act is because Republicans are talking about another bite of the apple via reconciliation. Now, this is, think of One Big Beautiful Bill, Part 2, and this is the process that allows Republicans to do it once per fiscal year. You avoid the Senate filibuster, so majority vote in the House, majority vote in the Senate. Now, there are a lot of healthcare changes have been discussed about this, tax changes, things about, increasing home builders, decreasing taxes associated with home building, but also just recently in light of Friday's ruling, you have some Republicans out there saying that they should reinstitute tariff authority via IEPA via reconciliation. All you need to know is that if President Trump talks about things last night or tomorrow night regarding that require legislative change, if it's via reconciliation, we have a 20% chance of that happening this year. The votes just aren't there. You can't get the House of Representatives aligned when you only have a margin of one. And when you have certain Republicans out there who are just pretty much at the point where they're not on board with the president's agenda, it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So whether it's for tariff authority or maybe some of the healthcare changes, et cetera. But again, if you need a copy of Dwayne's note, please let me know. The third theme you're going to hear about tomorrow is, in addition to tariffs, which we already discussed, but the third thing we'll hear about tomorrow is affordability. Now, President Trump is going to make a lot of repeat statements of what he's said over the last couple of weeks. He'll probably call for a credit card interest rate cap, probably call for the banning of corporation purchases of single-family homes. But the story here is that if it requires an act of legislation, it's very difficult to come by. Even that corporation ban, there's bipartisan warmth to it. And out of all the things that he said, that's probably the one that's going to drive the most headlines, because this week you are going to see the Senate work on housing reform, and the White House is pressuring to get that attached as an amendment to the housing bill. I don't think it's going to work, But again, that's something that we're going to keep an eye on. Where I'm going with this is that tomorrow on affordability, you're going to hear a lot of statements about it. It's going to lead to a lot of headline risk. But think of this. If it requires an act of legislation, it's probably not likely to happen. And if it requires regulation and it's a new idea, it's going to be quarters, if not years, to happen. And if it requires the executive order, then it's either going to be tested in the courts or he's going to try and do it via the bully pulpit. And that's most likely what you're going to see here is President Trump trying to use the bully pulpit. Think of things like, pressuring these banks to issue these credit cards, or just over the weekend, he was pressuring Netflix over, Susan Rice, one of their board members. So the bully pulpit is what most likely is the thing to keep in mind for the State of the Union address. So I apologize that we've gone a little bit longer, but, we've got a lot going on. I know this was really quick. So if you do need any deeper dive conversations, please feel free to reach out. Again, my email is ndean10@bloomberg.net. Be very much happy to have a conversation with you. Again, all of this here is available for you on the Bloomberg terminal. Stay safe, stay warm, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, bringing you the latest installment of his weekly Washington Policy Pulse. For more from BI or to join this call live each week, you can email Nathan at ndean@bloomberg.net. That's NDEAN@bloomberg.net. And come back to the podcast later today for the latest edition of Balance of Power.